There are love stories that make you smile. And then there are love stories that make you put down everything you are holding, lean closer to the screen, and quietly ask yourself, how is this even real? This is one of those stories. Two people from completely different corners of the world, separated by culture, by language, by thousands of miles of open ocean, somehow found each other. And when they did, what followed became something that nobody in their world had seen coming. Not the people who knew them, not the communities that had followed their journeys. And certainly not the two people living it themselves. Nancy Guthrie, a name that carries a particular kind of weight. A woman whose life has been carved by extraordinary pain, shaped by extraordinary faith, and defined by an extraordinary refusal to let either of those things have the final word. Tomaso Cioni. An Italian man whose warmth and quiet strength crossed an entire ocean, almost as if it knew exactly where it was supposed to land. But here is the thing about this story that most people miss when they first hear it. It is not simply a love story. It is a story about what happens to a person who has already been through the unsurvivable, who has already buried what felt like everything, and who then discovers, quietly and without warning, that life has been holding something back for them. Something they had long since stopped expecting. When people found out what was really unfolding between Nancy Guthrie and Tomaso Cioni, the reaction rippled through entire communities. Some people cried without fully understanding why. Some laughed with a kind of relieved, helpless joy. And some simply went still, sitting with the strange and overwhelming feeling of watching a story that had every reason to end in darkness somehow arrive somewhere luminous. So who are these two people really? And what exactly did everyone find that left them so deeply, completely stunned? Stay with this story, because what unfolds here is unlike almost anything else you will hear. Nancy Guthrie is not a celebrity in the way that word usually gets used. She is something rarer than that, and in many ways something more powerful. She is a woman who walked through the kind of grief that does not just wound a person but restructures them entirely, and who somehow came out the other side still upright, still speaking. Still offering something honest and real to a world that is often starving for exactly that. She became known as a speaker and an author, a trusted voice for people sitting in the darkest corners of their own lives, people who had lost children, people who had lost the thread of any reason to keep going, people who needed someone to look them directly in the eye without flinching and say, I have been there too, not metaphorically. Not from a comfortable distance. I have actually been there, and there is still something worth living for. Tomaso Cioni entered this story the way the most important things in life almost always do, quietly, without announcement, without any of the dramatic fanfare that the moment probably deserved. And together, these two people built something that startled everyone watching, reminded an entire community that even after the most devastating seasons a life can hold, something unexpected can still take root and bloom. This is their story, and it deserves to be told carefully. Before the speaking stages and the published books and the retreats and the audiences, Nancy Guthrie was simply a mother. And then she became a mother who had lost a child. And then, in a moment that defies the kind of comprehension most of us will never be asked to reach for, she became a mother who had lost another child. Two children. The same rare genetic condition. The same shattering heartbreak arriving twice, as if once had not been enough to test every limit a person possesses. There are certain kinds of grief that language was simply not built to carry. The kind that settles into the chest and does not move. The kind that reshapes the most ordinary moments, the way morning light looks, the way other families in parking lots feel like they belong to a different species. The way a simple question, like how many children do you have, becomes the most loaded sentence in any room. Nancy did not turn away from that grief. She did not soften it or package it or find a way to make it more palatable for the people around her. That, more than anything else, is what made her different. She sat inside it, she argued with it. She wrote about it in language that was raw and uneven, and honest in the way that only someone who is still actively bleeding can manage to be honest. Not the polished honesty of someone looking back from safety, but the trembling, costly honesty of someone writing from the middle of it. Her husband David stood with her through all of it. Their marriage in those seasons became its own kind of testimony. Two people who looked at everything falling apart around them and kept choosing each other anyway. Nancy began speaking at grief retreats. She began writing books that found their way into hospital waiting rooms and hospice corridors, and the quiet, impossible hours of 3 in the morning when a person is alone with something they cannot name. She became a trusted voice not because she arrived with clean answers, but because she had clearly sat with the hardest questions long enough to stop pretending they were easy. She built an entire community around honest grief, around the radical idea that faith does not shield you from suffering, but that it can walk alongside you through it without looking away. And for a long, full, meaningful season of her life, that was the shape of her world: service, speaking, writing, holding careful space for other people's pain while quietly carrying her own. Nobody who knew her then, nobody who sat in those audiences or read those pages late at night, could have predicted what was quietly moving toward her. Because what was moving toward her carried an Italian accent and a particular kind of warmth, and it was crossing the Atlantic as if it had somewhere very specific to be. The first thing you need to understand about Tommaso Cioni is that he was not a man who set out to become part of an extraordinary story. He was simply living, the way most people do, inside the familiar rhythms of an ordinary life, until something extraordinary found him and interrupted everything. Tomaso came from Italy, from a culture where community is not a concept but a daily practice, where meals stretch for hours because no one is in any hurry for the warmth to end, where affection is not performed but simply expressed as naturally as breathing. He carried that culture the way a person carries their mother tongue, effortlessly and without thinking about it. How Tomaso and Nancy found each other is the kind of detail that stops a conversation cold when people hear it for the first time. Because it did not happen the way love stories are supposed to happen, there was no crowded event, no electric glance across a room, no mutual friend with a carefully designed plan and a knowing smile watching from the corner. What happened was quieter than any of that, more accidental. More of the kind of beginning that makes you want to believe, even against your most carefully constructed defenses, that certain things are simply meant to find each other. Nancy had spent her life building something out of words. She had spoken truth into painful places, had written sentences that traveled into grief-stricken rooms, and did something there that she could not always predict or control. And those words, as it turned out, did not stop at any border. They traveled across languages and oceans and time zones. They traveled until they landed somewhere in Italy, in front of a man who understood loss in his own language, who had sat with his own version of the heaviness Nancy had spent years describing. When they eventually connected, something happened that neither of them had prepared for and neither of them could quite explain. Something clicked into place with a certainty that felt less like coincidence and more like recognition. And here is the detail that stunned the people who knew Nancy most deeply. This woman who had poured herself into others for so long, this woman who had quietly made her peace with a life organized around service and with a kind of solitude that follows tremendous loss, suddenly found herself standing inside something she had genuinely not expected to encounter again. Something tender, something that required her to stop being only a speaker and a writer and a guide and to simply be a person. A person willing, for perhaps the first time in a long time, to receive something good. That shift, that small and enormous decision to remain open, that is the moment where everything truly changed. When word began to travel through the communities that had gathered around Nancy's work, the response was unlike anything those communities had seen. People who had turned to her books in their most desperate hours, who had sat in dark rooms underlining sentences that felt like they had been written specifically for their pain, felt something move inside them when they heard. Because here was the woman who had helped them survive, and she was standing in the middle of something joyful. Not a joy that erased what had come before. Not a brightness that pretended the losses had not happened or that the scars were not still there, but a deep, grounded, almost defiant joy. The kind that looks directly at everything it has survived and says quietly, there are still chapters here that have not been written. For so many people following her story, this was not just good news, it was evidence. Evidence that the things Nancy had been saying from stages and in books for years, that hope is not naivety, that the story does not end where pain tells you it ends. That something you cannot yet see can still be real and still be coming, was something she herself was now living in full view. Tomaso brought something visible into Nancy's world. Observers could see it almost immediately, a particular lightness, a presence that shifted the atmosphere around her. A specific kind of laughter, the unguarded kind, the kind that cannot be rehearsed or manufactured. And Nancy brought into Tomaso's life what people who have truly suffered and survived and remained open always bring: a depth that cannot be taught. An understanding of fragility that makes tenderness not a performance but a reflex. The photographs that quietly began to appear told their own version of the story. Two people navigating the beautiful, slightly awkward work of building something entirely new later in life. The cross-cultural moments of confusion and humor. The translations, both the linguistic ones and the deeper emotional ones that take so much longer to complete, people were not merely happy for them. People were moved in the particular way you are moved, when something you almost stopped believing in turns out to be real. Because the message traveling through this story was larger than any single caption or post could hold. That grief does not get the final word, that loss is not a destination. That somewhere sometimes in the quiet space after you have stopped searching and simply started living, something extraordinary steps through the door. But what happened next, even then, surprised the people who thought they had already understood where this was going. Here is something nobody prepares you for when unexpected joy arrives after a long season of loss. Joy is terrifying. For a person who carries the kind of grief Nancy Guthrie carries, happiness itself can feel like a form of exposure, because grief teaches you something that nothing else does. It teaches you with complete and undeniable evidence that beautiful things can be removed from your life. You are not speculating about this. You are not being pessimistic. You have the proof. You have lived through it happening, and you have lived through it happening again. So when something good arrives, the instinct is not always to run toward it. Sometimes the instinct is to go very still, to hold your breath and to quietly ask, is this real, and what is it going to cost me this time? Nancy had built everything she was known for on a foundation of honesty, on refusing to make pain smaller than it was for the comfort of her audience, on telling the truth at full volume even when that truth made everyone in the room uncomfortable, including herself. So when this new chapter appeared, she brought that same unflinching honesty to it. She did not smooth over the complications. A relationship that requires crossing continents is not a simple undertaking. Two people who have each lived full and layered lives, who carry their own histories and their own communities and their own children and their own calendars, are not clean slates. The practical realities of what they were building together did not bend politely to the romance of the story. And underneath all of it, hovering over every decision, was a question that did not have an easy answer. What does it mean to build something new, when the identity you have lived in for years was built almost entirely around what you lost? For the people watching from the outside, that question made the story not simpler but richer, because this was not a fairy tale being performed for an audience. This was a real woman, navigating in real time, the disorienting and quietly courageous work of figuring out whether she was permitted to be happy. Whether happiness after that much grief was something available to her, or whether choosing it somehow betrayed the loss she had tended so faithfully. Tomaso, in all of this, did not push. That patience, that willingness to let something find its natural pace, rather than forcing it into a shape that was easier to explain, revealed something about his character that no simple description could fully reach. And then came the moment that nobody was entirely prepared for. The moment when Nancy Guthrie, the woman who had spent years writing about the discipline of sitting with pain, looked at something beautiful that had arrived in her life and made the deliberate, conscious, costly choice to stay inside it. When you look closely at where this story actually arrives, you find something different from what you expected when it began. You expected a neat ending. Something that tied cleanly and gave you permission to feel good on your way out. A conclusion shaped to be satisfying. What you find instead is something far more honest, and because of that, far more powerful. You find a woman who has become a living argument simply by continuing to live, against the idea that grief is something you arrive at and stay inside permanently. Nancy's story after Tomaso is not a story of grief disappearing. It is a story of grief doing something it does not often do, expanding, making room. Accommodating something it was never originally built to hold, but holding it anyway, the way old structures sometimes surprise everyone by proving they were stronger than they looked. Her work did not slow down. If anything, it became more grounded, more embodied, more sure of itself. Because she was no longer speaking about hope as something she had chosen to believe in from a distance. She was speaking about it as something her own life had demanded she either fully commit to or walk away from entirely. She had committed. Tomaso, in the particular and irreplaceable warmth of who he is, gave her story a texture it had simply never had before. The story of Nancy Guthrie was always remarkable. But it became something else entirely when it expanded to include the specific comedy and tenderness of two people from different worlds, slowly figuring out whose traditions take precedence. which words do not survive translation intact, and why that imprecision, that beautiful gap between languages and cultures, is somehow the funniest and most intimate space two people can share. The community that had formed around Nancy's grief drew an even closer around her joy, because they recognized it. They recognized what hope actually looks like when it stops being a theological concept and becomes a specific person standing in your kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning. They recognized the particular kind of courage it requires to remain open after catastrophic loss, not the visible courage of someone holding themselves together for a watching audience, but the private, daily, almost invisible courage of a person who wakes up each morning and chooses, again, not to lock the door. What they found about Nancy Guthrie and Tomaso Cioni left people speechless, not because it was shocking in the way scandal is shocking, but because it was so unexpectedly, so thoroughly, so almost unbearably good. And in a world that is never short of reasons for sorrow, a story about two people finding each other across an ocean, after everything each of them had already survived, feels less like a love story and more like a small, specific, quietly insistent miracle. Maybe the most truthful thing that can be said about this story is simply this: none of us choose what we lose, that part is not up to us. The losses arrive on their own schedule, in their own forms, without asking whether we are ready. But some people, the ones who somehow find the courage to stay open even after the worst has already happened, get to choose something else. They get to choose what they do with the space that loss carves out and leaves behind. Nancy Guthrie filled that space with honesty and service and words that found people in the dark, and sat with them there for a long time. And then, when she had long since stopped watching the door, something came through it. Tomaso Cioni walked into a story that was already extraordinary, and made it into something that even the person who had lived every chapter of it could not have written alone. So here is the question worth carrying with you when this story ends. Is there a door in your own life that you quietly closed, because loss taught you that open doors are just invitations for more pain? And you are sitting here now wondering whether there might be something worth the risk of opening it again, even just slightly, even just enough to see what might be standing on the other side. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because I genuinely believe this story is going to land differently for every single person who hears it, and I want to know where it landed for you.